The footprints were in ground the Marines had already passed. That was the problem. Company G had been moving southwest of Con Thien on October 4, 1967, through an area they had been working for hours. They had already found abandoned mortar positions. They had already found loose ammunition and old bunkers. Other companies in the same sweep were turning up shelters and ambush sites all over the ground around the hill. Then, Company G started backtracking, and there they were. Fresh enemy footprints around bunkers that had already been destroyed. Not yesterday's sign, not some old trail everybody knew about. Fresh sign, in a place the Marines had reason to think they had already accounted for. That changes the question fast. You stop asking, where did they go? You start asking, when did they come through here? Because if the answer is after you passed, then the ground behind you is no longer just the way home. Somebody else has been using it too. The official Marine history only gives us a few sentences about that moment. It does not tell us which Marine saw the first print. It does not tell us what he said. It does not give us the exact shape of the track, how deep it was, or whether one man bent down and touched the mud. So I am not going to make any of that up. We do know what happened to the company after the discovery. Tension went up. The three Marine companies in that part of the sweep began moving back toward the perimeter west of Con Thien. And while Company G was pulling back, the Marines heard movement. That is enough to understand why those footprints mattered. The footprints did not give them an enemy position. They changed the meaning of the route. Con Thien had a way of doing that to men. By October of 1967, there was very little about the ground around that hill that felt neutral. For weeks, Marine units had been finding bunkers, trenches, and firing positions around the combat base. They would clear one area, destroy what they found, move on, and later discover signs that North Vietnamese troops had come back. That is exactly the kind of situation where a footprint stops being a curiosity. It becomes timing. Company G was part of 2D Battalion, 4th Marines, one of the units that had already been worn down badly during the fighting in the north. The battalion had spent much of September around Con Thien and the DMZ. It had taken enough casualties that its effective strength had fallen far below what it had been when it came into the area. The men knew they were not walking through empty country. What they did not know on October 4th was where the enemy was at that exact moment. That distinction matters. A Marine can know enemy troops are somewhere nearby and still have a usable plan. The trouble starts when new evidence tells him that one of his assumptions about where they are is wrong. Company G had already moved over that ground. Now fresh tracks were there. So either the Marines had missed the men who made them, or those men had moved into the area after the Marines passed. Neither answer made the return route more comfortable. This is where I think people who have never spent time in the field can misunderstand a story like this. A patrol does not need a firefight for the situation to change. Sometimes the whole day turns on something that does not make a sound. A boot print. A branch that was not broken before. A position that was empty in the morning and does not look empty anymore. A trail that now tells two different stories, depending on which direction you read it. And for the Marines around Con Thien, the difficult part was that the enemy knew the same ground. The North Vietnamese had spent months operating around those hills, roads, draws, and tree lines. Marine patrols could clear a position and leave it. The other side could come back after dark, or after the patrol moved through, or simply wait somewhere the Marines had not searched. That does not make the enemy supernatural. It means the map is not fixed. The Marines knew where they had been. They did not automatically know who had moved behind them afterward. Earlier that day, the sweep had looked productive. The battalion left its line of departure at 6:45 in the morning. By 8:30, Marines had found NVA shelters. An hour later, they were a little farther on and were finding more ambush sites and bunkers. Company H found another group of bunkers while moving around the southwest side of Con Thien. Company G came across abandoned mortar positions and loose 82mm rounds along with powder charge increments. That is a lot of enemy infrastructure for a morning in which there had not been a major contact. And that is part of the trap in the story. Every abandoned position can make you feel as if the problem is behind you. You found it. You searched it. You destroyed what needed destroying. You moved on. Then the ground tells you somebody may have moved back in. At about 3 in the afternoon, another discovery stopped the Marines. The smell from partially covered graves led them to the bodies of 20 North Vietnamese soldiers. That gave them one more piece of information about what had happened in the area before they got there. But it still did not tell them where the living enemy was now. That is the difference between evidence and control. The dead can tell you where a fight happened. The fresh footprints tell you somebody has moved since. Company G began backtracking. And somewhere in that process, around bunkers that had already been dealt with, they found the new sign. I want to stay with that word, backtracking, because it means the Marines were not entering totally unknown ground at that moment. They were looking at ground they had already seen. That is why the fresh tracks had power. If you find footprints on a trail you have never walked before, they tell you somebody was there. If you find fresh footprints while retracing a route you believe you recently crossed, they can tell you something more uncomfortable. The situation changed after you left. That turns the past few hours into a question. How far back did it change? Were the tracks from one man? Several? A larger element? Were they moving away? Were they moving across the Marine route? Had they been watching the sweep? The official history does not answer those questions. The Marines did not get to wait until somebody wrote the answers down for them. They had to move with uncertainty still attached to the ground. And this is where the title problem becomes larger than the footprints. At first, the problem is simple. There is fresh sign behind you. Then it becomes, what part of the route can you still trust? A patrol's return path is valuable because it is known. You remember the ground. You remember the difficult spots. You know roughly what is on the other side of the next rise. You know where your own people have been. But that advantage starts shrinking if another force has moved into the same space behind you. Now the route is familiar to both sides. By late afternoon, the 3 companies were heading back toward the Marine perimeter west of Con Thien. Company G had not made a clean identification of the enemy force from the footprints. There is an important human truth in that. Most decisions in the field are not made after perfect confirmation. They are made when the amount of uncertainty becomes unacceptable. The footprints did not need to prove an ambush. They only needed to prove the area was more active than it had looked. The Marines changed their behavior accordingly. They began returning. Then, Company G heard movement. No clear enemy formation appears in the record at that point. No neat line of men steps out where everybody can see them. Just movement. And now, those footprints from a few minutes earlier matter even more. Without the footprints, noise in heavy country can be anything. With the footprints, the same noise belongs to a different problem. The Marines treated the return as exposed enough that they requested supporting fire to cover the movement back. The official history says they observed no North Vietnamese casualties from that action. That is another useful detail because it keeps the story honest. There is no big payoff where the tracks lead to a dramatic fight, and everybody finds out exactly who made them. The Marines returned with uncertainty still intact. But they did not return with the same understanding they had before the footprints appeared. They now knew the enemy was still active around the positions they had been clearing. That mattered beyond one afternoon. A few days later, 2D Battalion, 4th Marines, took over defense of a newly built bridge north of Strong Point C2. The battalion was in poor shape. The Marine history says the unit's foxhole strength had dropped from 952 men to about 462. Think about that for a second. The battalion was being asked to hold ground around Con Thien, with roughly half the manpower it had once had available for those positions. That makes small pieces of information matter more. You do not have endless men to put everywhere. You cannot treat every noise as a full attack. You cannot assume every empty bunker is empty tomorrow. Somebody has to decide what deserves attention. Fresh tracks can do that. 10 days after the October 4 sweep, the battalion would face a much larger attack at the C2 bridge position. I do not want to turn this episode into that battle. It is a different story. But what happened on October 14th proves one thing that the footprints on October 4th had already suggested. North Vietnamese units were not gone from the area just because a Marine sweep did not find them standing in the open. The ground around Con Thien remained contested, even when it looked quiet. That is why the little things carried weight. There is a photograph from Vietnam that captures this kind of work better than most dramatic combat photographs ever could. A Kit Carson scout attached to Company B, 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry, is shown pointing out fresh enemy footprints to the company commander during a search and clear operation west of Fire Support Base Thien. No shooting, no heroic pose. A man points at the dirt, and another man looks. That is the whole picture. But there is a decision hiding inside it. How old? How many? Which way? Does it change what we do next? Those are not questions about tracking as a hobby. They are questions about whether the plan you had 5 minutes ago is still a good plan. And that is what Company G had to deal with at Con Thien. The Marines had a mission for the day. They were sweeping. They were finding positions. They were destroying enemy works. They were moving through ground that had been fought over before. Then, one ordinary piece of sign told them the enemy's relationship to that ground was more current than they thought. The ground they had checked was not staying checked. That is the midpoint of the whole story for me. The question is no longer, who made those footprints? The question is, what does it mean if the ground behind us is changing while we are still moving forward? Because you cannot solve that by staring at the print longer. Eventually, somebody has to make a decision about the company, and the Marine record shows what decision came next. They moved back toward the perimeter. That does not mean they were running from footprints. It means the tracks belong to a larger set of facts. Fresh sign, previously occupied positions, a heavily contested area, a battalion that had already been ground down, late afternoon coming on, then movement heard during the return. Put together, those facts change what continuing the sweep is worth. This is the part of field experience that is hard to reproduce on paper. The report might list each item on a separate line. A bunker, a mortar position, graves, footprints, movement, return. But the men did not experience them as separate entries. Each new thing changed the last thing. The abandoned mortar position looked different after the fresh tracks. The fresh tracks meant more after the movement. The route home meant more, because they now knew someone had used the area behind them. That is how uncertainty builds without anybody needing to announce it. And if you were in Vietnam, and you ever had a trail, a position, or a piece of ground change meaning because of one small sign, I would like to hear that story in the comments. Not the dramatic part. The small thing you noticed first. A print, a smell, something moved. A place that was too quiet. Include the unit and year if you want to. Those are exactly the details that do not survive well in official histories. One other thing is easy to miss when you read an account like this 50 years later. The men did not have the luxury of treating each clue as a puzzle they could solve completely before moving on. A footprint ages while you are looking at it. Daylight changes. The rest of the unit is still moving. The mission still has a clock on it, even if nobody says the word. So the value of the sign is not that it gives you a perfect answer. Its value is that it changes how much confidence you have in the answer you were already using. That is a very different kind of judgment. And it is probably why veterans remember these little things so clearly. The event itself might have lasted seconds. The consequence could shape the next hour. A man sees something in the dirt. Nobody fires. Nobody is hit. Nothing explodes. But the whole company starts thinking differently about the ground behind it. Those are the moments I think history tends to flatten out, because the official language is so calm. Fresh enemy footprints. 4 words. In the field, 4 words can mean the route you just trusted now needs to be reconsidered. There is another reason I like this story. Nobody in it needs to be made superhuman. The Marines did not look at a footprint and magically know the enemy's plan. They did not suddenly become jungle trackers who could tell you a man's age and breakfast from one mark in the mud. They had evidence, they had experience, and they had limits. The evidence told them enemy personnel had been there recently. It did not tell them exactly where those men were now. Experience told them that mattered. Their limits meant they had to act before certainty arrived. That is much closer to the real work of a patrol. Most of the time, the important information is incomplete. You keep moving anyway, or you decide not to. At Con Thien, the Marines had already learned that fixed positions could be rebuilt. The official history says patrols around the hill repeatedly found bunker and trench complexes. Marines destroyed them, and later patrols sometimes found them rebuilt again. That tells you how temporary the word cleared could be. Cleared at 9 in the morning did not necessarily mean clear at 4 in the afternoon. And on October 4th, Company G found a small piece of proof. Fresh footprints around positions they had already been through. That one detail compressed the whole problem of Con Thien into the dirt. The Marines could occupy the hill. They could patrol outward. They could destroy positions. They could return the next day. But the enemy was moving too. Sometimes close enough behind them to leave new tracks on ground the Marines thought they already understood. This is why a trail in Vietnam could be useful and dangerous at the same time. It made movement easier. It also concentrated movement. It showed where people had been. Sometimes it showed where your own people had been. And if another force crossed it after you, you had to decide whether the route was still helping you, or simply telling the other side where you were likely to go. I am keeping that broad on purpose. There is no value in pretending a historical story is a field manual. The interesting part is the responsibility. Somebody had to decide when the sign was enough. Enough to stop treating the afternoon as a normal sweep. Enough to start thinking seriously about the return. Enough to understand that an empty bunker was not evidence of an empty area. The Marines made it back to their perimeter. The record does not give us a clean confirmation of who made those particular footprints. There is no captured map at the end, with a red line showing exactly how an NVA element moved around Company G. No final interrogation fixes the sequence. The story ends with less certainty than a movie would want. But it ends with enough. The Marines had gone into the day finding signs of where the enemy had been. They came out of it knowing the enemy was still moving through the same ground. That is a very different kind of information. And it changes the way you remember those first footprints. At the moment they were found, they were just marks in the earth around old bunkers. By the time Company G was moving back and hearing movement nearby, those marks had become a warning that the map behind them was no longer the map they had walked through that morning. If this kind of Vietnam story is why you are here, the small decisions, the things men noticed before anybody knew what they meant, the work underneath the famous battles. Subscribe. There are a lot of these stories left, and the veterans who can still add the missing detail are part of the record too. On October 4th, 1967, Company G did not find the enemy standing on the trail waiting to be identified. They found something smaller, fresh footprints in ground they had already passed. And that was enough to make the way back look different.